Hello, Nicola Spurling here. Welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be doing something a little bit different here. I'm going to be answering your questions. I put out a tweet asking what you would like to hear a trans person answer that maybe you didn't feel comfortable asking publicly. So I accepted DMs as well as replies to the tweet. And I did try to reply as much as possible to the tweet itself, but I'm also going to address all of these questions here in this video. And I apologize in advance because it's extremely hot in here, so if you see me sweating, you'll know why. But let's get into this. So the first question here comes from @the8thworld, and it says, I'm a teacher. A student told me his preferred pronouns, name. Then I had a conference with mom who dead-named Misgendered the child. The student wasn't there. I didn't know what to do. Not sure if the student had told mom either. Any thoughts would be appreciated. So my response to this tweet is that it's really important that as allies you address these kinds of situations and that you act on behalf of the trans person and you call out transphobic behavior where you might see it, and also that you just remind people to be respectful. And the trick with this particular situation is that the teacher doesn't know if the kid is out to their parents. And that creates complication because you don't want to necessarily out that child to their parents. So what you really need to do in this situation is check in with the student first and say, do your parents know? Are you struggling with them using the correct pronouns? And if they say yes, and they say that they're okay with you advocating on their behalf, then it would be acceptable for you to have a conversation. And I would actually encourage you to have that conversation because from your point of privilege, it may be taken more seriously. And if people know that folks around them recognize that behavior and have an issue with it, then they also might be willing to take that more seriously. The next question here comes from Zachary Bauer 1, and the question is, do you think it would be insensitive for a cis person to play as trans in an RPG like D&D? What if there was a magic plot device like changes a parent's sex in true form? Do you think there's any truth in male sex but female gender? Type explanations of what being transgender is. This is a tough one for me to answer because I don't play RPG games. I just never had the opportunity to get into them. So I was trying to get some clarity around this and what it was that they were asking because I was not quite familiar with some of the questions and the terminology. What they're asking for is a lot like making up a character for a book where you speak in first person. And they say, I'm referring more to cis people who know they're cis playing trans people. And I know that there's controversy in acting, for instance. So yes, there is controversy in acting. And the problem with that is that you might be misrepresenting trans people to the public at large. And you also might be taking jobs away from trans people. And that's why it's extremely problematic in those kinds of settings in movies and TV shows. When it comes to a game like this, if a person in a small group of friends wants to play a trans character, I can't speak for all trans people, but I don't have a lot of problem with that, especially when you consider the fact that a lot of people who are trans have in the past played characters of what they considered to be the opposite gender when they were younger, when they were trying to come to terms with who they are, with their gender identity. And that is extremely helpful. So while someone might seem cis playing a trans character, you don't really know if the reasoning behind that might be deeper and if they want to play that character because they're trying to explore their own gender identity. And I definitely don't want to say that that's wrong. I don't want to put any barriers in place for people who might want to be experimenting with their gender identity and trying to figure out who they are, provided they're being respectful of the others around them. This next question comes from @StewieKills, and it's, I watched a Netflix documentary about a Navy SEAL that came out trans. One of the things that struck me was she said it was scary coming out than being shot at in combat. Where the hell do you find the courage? I realize I actually missed this one and I didn't respond to it. Someone else replied, speaking for myself, Army veteran, black, trans man, it comes from the same courage it takes for any human being to be their true self regardless of the outcome. This person's username is @PastorDay13. And there is a lot of truth in that. Everyone's going to have their own experiences, but when it comes to being brave, I think a lot of the time that is used to describe trans people because folks view being trans as some kind of radical thing in a world that says trans people shouldn't exist. It's extremely brave to be yourself. And in a lot of ways it is, but in a lot of ways trans people see that as, I'm just trying to be myself. The alternative is to be dead or to be extremely depressed or just not enjoying life. And so to be able to be yourself, as much as you put yourself in harm's way, in a lot of ways it's actually easier than trying to hide who you are, and that's why we come out. So it's sort of a very tricky question to answer. The courage really just comes from finally reaching the point where you say, I can't take it anymore, and I'm at a breaking point, and the alternative to being myself is so much worse that I have to transition. This next question comes from Zoe Ta GX, and it says, not for trans people, but why do cis people or other trans people overdo it with praise and say, yes girl with 10 eyes, when we do anything remotely feminine, grind my gears, yes queen, girly, yes slay, like, I just go to the shops in my clothes. So this is a pretty common one. I've received a lot of this. I think it's well-intentioned. I think the people that are doing it think they're trying to reinforce our gender identity, trying to make us feel good, trying to make us feel like we're valid and authentic, but it almost comes across as patronizing. It doesn't necessarily drive home the point that they think it drives home. And when we hear things like that, we're like, oh yeah, again, and why do we keep getting this? We're not some show. We're just being ourselves. You don't say this to other women. Why are you saying it to trans women? So, while I think it's well-intentioned, and while I'm not going to tell someone like that they're being transphobic per se, I do think that if this is the kind of thing that you're participating in, try to tone it down a little, reinforce people, make them feel like they're valid and accepted, but you don't need to go overboard and treat trans people like they're drag queens and using all of this sort of gay slang. This next one comes from Hermione Wants at E1, and they say, as an ally, how much should I be speaking about trans issues, and how can I make sure that I'm speaking in a way that's respectful and actually helpful? I really don't think that you can speak on trans issues too much. I don't think an ally can overdo it with talking about trans issues. We really want to get as much information out into the public as possible that we can, but you have to make sure that you're doing it in a well-informed way. You have to make sure that you've done your research and that you know what you're talking about, because it's not helpful to be misrepresenting trans people. It's also not helpful to try to make this your narrative and to co-opt it and to use trans people for clout. So as much as you might want to speak on these issues, and you can, also make sure that you're amplifying the voices of trans people, because that's really important so that trans people get to speak for themselves. And if you have some kind of platform, however big or small that may be, using it to try to amplify the voices of marginalized people is always the best thing to do. And if there are instances where you can speak generically from your own point of view, that is also fine. This next one comes from at Macy19891125. They ask, how do you put up with being misgendered when they know your pronouns? Now, this is something that I deal with on a semi-regular basis, not so much anymore as I did when I was early in my transition, because the people that are close to me have managed to figure that all out. And if I'm in public, people don't necessarily know my pronouns to begin with, so I'm a little bit more lenient that way. But when it comes to being misgendered, I personally don't really care all that much. I don't get a lot of dysphoria from being misgendered. Obviously, I can tell when someone's doing it maliciously, and I'll stand up to that. But if it's a slip of the tongue, or I'm wearing my construction clothes and I'm looking quite masculine, I don't usually say anything. But if it happens to someone that I know, I will correct people, because I know that even though it doesn't bother me all that much, it does bother a lot of trans people, and I don't want to let that slide. And that's why I bring it up if it's done maliciously to me, because I want to be able to confront that and make sure that I'm stopping it from happening to another trans person, or at least letting that person know that what they're doing is wrong and that I'm not going to put up with it. when it happens to someone else, regardless of whether it's malicious or not, I do want to make sure that I'm putting in that correction just to be a good ally to them. And as a trans person, yes, I can still be an ally to other trans people, and that's what I try to do. So when it comes to issues that don't necessarily affect me, if I know that they affect someone else, I will speak up on them. I've done that in my videos, and I do that in real life as well. Now, this person also says that they will misgender transphobes. And it's a way, I suppose, of getting back at them and giving them a taste of their own medicine. This is not something that I do. I don't necessarily want to stoop to their level, and I don't want to make it seem like it's ever okay to misgender someone. No matter how much you may dislike a person, it's still not an excuse to misgender someone. And I think that's an important message to drive home. And that's something that I try to take into all aspects of my life, is that when someone else goes low, I go high. I try to take the high road whenever possible, and I slip up just like anyone does, but ultimately my goal is always to try to take the high road. This next one comes from @SinclairIT, and it says, if everyone would gender you correctly no matter what, would you still feel the need to medically or socially transition? And coming back to the previous question about being misgendered, I don't care if I'm misgendered. That's not the reason that I transitioned. And I don't necessarily need to look a certain way or act a certain way in order to be comfortable with who I am. I'm not trying to put on a show. I'm not trying to pretend that I'm a woman. I am a woman, and I act as myself. I don't try to act the way I think a woman should act. When I was pretending to be a man, that's when I was acting. That's when I was trying to act a certain way to try to make people believe that I was a man. And that's a very tough thing to do. So the short answer to that is no. Even if people had gendered me correctly back then, I still would have felt the need to socially and medically transition, because socially I was not presenting myself to the world in a way that I felt comfortable with. And I also wasn't comfortable with my body, and I needed to get on hormones and have surgery in order to correct that and make myself feel comfortable in my own skin. So moving on to the DMs now, I'm not going to read out people's usernames because they sent me a DM, which means they probably want their question to be private, but I will read you out what they said and I'll provide you with my answer. This person says, "Hi, I wanted to ask if any trans or non-binary people felt like maybe they were faking it just because they want to be part of something. This is kind of personal because I was born a girl, but since a kid thought myself as a boy, but eventually society pressure and parents forcing me to use girl pronouns and behave like a girl, I stopped speaking like a boy or using boy pronouns, and I'm pretty much comfortable as my image as a girl, but there are occasions when the label girl feels wrong and suffocating, when I don't want to be labeled at all. I don't want to be bound by any kind of gender image and roles. I just want to be me, not a boy nor a girl, but I like girl pronouns. They, them feel a bit odd. I just don't know, and sometimes I think maybe I'm faking it. It is a mess." Now, this is a complicated one to get into, and it's a very personal one, and everyone's going to have their own experiences with how they come to terms with being trans or not being trans. And I don't want to say that this person is trans. One thing I do want to point out with regard to pronouns is that you could potentially be a non-binary person and still use she, her, hers pronouns. And that is maybe where this person would fit in. And we had this conversation, and I don't want to put labels on them. This is up to them to figure out. But I just wanted to make it clear that those kinds of options do exist. If you're non-binary, you don't have to use they, them, their pronouns if they don't feel right for you. And you also don't have to stick to gender roles or societal expectations just because you're one of these binary genders. And I try to live my life that way. I'm interested in a lot of masculine things, and I present myself in a very masculine way sometimes, and that's fine. That doesn't make me any less of a woman, nor would it make a cis person any less of a woman if they were to do that. As far as feeling like you're faking it, I think a lot of people deal with this. When I was coming to terms with being trans, I went through my history. I realized that I'd been feeling like a girl throughout my entire childhood, and yet I still thought maybe I'm faking it, maybe this isn't right. So I didn't rush into anything, and you don't have to rush into anything if you're not certain. part of coming to terms with being trans is going through all of these scenarios in your head to make sure that what you have experienced in your life, what you're currently experiencing, and what you will be experiencing in the future aligns with your gender identity, and also recognizing that your gender identity or how you view your gender identity can evolve over time. The way that I dealt with these feelings of faking it was to really be careful and to be confident in every single change that I made. As I approached my transition, I would look at things in my life that I wanted to change, and I would make sure that this is a change I definitely wanted to make. And then I would make that change. I would wait until I became confident in that change before moving on to the next one. And throughout that, I eventually made my way through transitioning. But it wasn't because I need to change everything about myself and transition all at once. It was because I was able to make all those small changes and they added up to where I am today. And that's still something I use in my life, not necessarily for transitioning, but for every life decision I might make. I want to be confident in what I'm doing, so I don't make a ton of changes all at once. I will make one change and become confident in it, and then make another change and become confident in that. The other thing to point out here is that this idea of faking it is not something that trans people specifically deal with. This is often considered imposter syndrome, and it can come out in various aspects of your life. One of the common ones would be at work, where you feel like you're not good enough for the position that you hold, and that you're faking it, and they're eventually going to find you out and realize that you are not as good as you might have portrayed yourself to be. And it's something a lot of us struggle with. It's difficult to view yourself as a professional in a certain field because it's a constant learning process. So even when you might be considered a professional by the people around you, you yourself know that you still have a lot to learn, and that can make you feel like you are in a position where you're faking it and where you're an imposter. As trans people, a lot of the time, we can feel that as well, and it doesn't mean that we're not trans just because we're questioning that. Doesn't mean that we're not trans. It just means that we need to question it, and it's something that we need to be able to work through. This next question says, hey, I have a trans-related question that I'm afraid to ask my trans friends because it might be super dumb or offensive. I'm writing a sci-fi story with a major character who happens to be transgender. I've talked to people, I've done research. The one question remains, how do I reveal his status to the audience? Especially in a story where cyborgs and aliens and psychics exist, I can't imagine it would be really an issue. So, we're talking about fiction here. Fiction can go in a variety of different ways, and fiction can portray people in any possible way. Now, you need to make sure that you're respectful of trans people, but you also, in fiction, can have trans people put in any number of scenarios. So we sort of talked this through. We had a lot of back and forth around this, and I don't think there's really any one right answer. One of the things that their trans friends had said is that it would make sense for them to reveal the trans status of the character early on in the book. And the reason for that is that a lot of times trans people are viewed to be hiding their gender from the world and coming out later and disrupting people's lives and faking it for a long time. And they view that as sort of evil, and this person didn't think that the author should play into that stereotype. Now, I don't necessarily agree with that. However, I think by revealing a person's trans status earlier on, you don't have to do quite as much explaining. You can have them come out in a way that's comfortable to them, or you can have them come out in a way where they're forced out and you explain why it's wrong for them to have been forced out. If they're coming out later, you can still have those conversations, but you also then need to have a conversation around why this person is not evil for coming out later, what societal pressures might have been placed on them in this fictional world that caused them to not be able to reveal that until later on. So if you're writing a fictional piece and you're including a trans character and you want them to come out at some point, make sure that you have a trans person read over that ahead of time, and just make sure that the way that you're going about it is respectful. It's always good to have multiple eyes on something like this, and having multiple eyes who are knowledgeable can be a really big asset. And also recognizing that not every trans people is going to have the same perspective, as I've explained already, where the friend gave them that advice for the trans person to come out early. And when it comes to fictional pieces, I don't necessarily think there are a lot of rules that you have to follow. I just think that you need to make sure that you explain everything in a respectful way. So that's it for this round of questions. I hope that you enjoyed this. I realized that I had a little bit of a mic malfunction here. I apologize for that. It seems that my mic stand is not the best and can't really carry the weight of the microphone, so please excuse that. I will try to set up in a little bit of a better way next time. I had some people tell me that they wanted the camera a little further back so I could do some better crops, and also just in this format with having my computer in front of me, I had to do that. So I'll have to figure out that mic stand for next time. But I hope that you enjoyed everything. If you have more questions that you want me to answer, please leave them in the comments below. I would like to do another part to this because I know that there are a lot more questions that I still haven't answered. And if you want to see more content like this, please hit the subscribe button and hit the bell icon so you get notified every time I post a new video. And until next time, have a great day.
You make